The wind in Wyoming doesn't just blow, it mourns. It's a low, lonely sound that gets into your bones and rattles around in the empty spaces. For Nathaniel Prescott, it was the only song he'd heard for 3 long years, a funeral dirge that never ended. His ranch wasn't a home. It was a graveyard of dust and dying grass, a monument to a life that had ended before his own. The cabin was a tomb built for two, but a fever had stolen one, and the child she carried, leaving only him and the crushing silence. His wife Mary was gone. All that was left was the wind and the chores, a circle of misery he walked every single day. Rise, mend the fences that couldn't keep anything in or out. Feed the bone-thin cattle that looked at him with hollow, accusing eyes. Draw water from a well that was getting closer to dry with every bucket. Sleep, or try to. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life, a man too poor to hire help and too broken to even hope for more. The folks down in Redemption, the nearest town, saw a quiet man, a sad case. They didn't see the man who still reached for his wife in the dead of night, his hand finding only the cold, empty sheets that held her scent no longer. They didn't see the man whose heart was a locked room, a room he had swallowed the key to years ago. He was just waiting, waiting for the wind to finally erode him down to nothing. Then one day, the rhythm broke. The circle shattered. He saw it from the low hill where he'd been trying to fix a stretch of fence with wire that was more rust than metal. At first, it was just a dark line on the horizon, a smudge against the endless blue sky. But it was moving. It wasn't a settler's wagon train. It wasn't a posse. As the line drew closer, resolving into individual shapes, a cold dread snaked its way up his spine. They were riders, dozens of them, and they were Cheyenne. His hand went to the pistol on his hip, an old reflex from a younger man, a man who still had something to protect. He didn't even think about it. He just watched them come, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. This was how it ended. He'd always known the land would take him. He just hadn't known it would send an army to do it. The main group stopped 100 yards out, a silent, intimidating wall of horses and men. 4 riders broke away and came forward. One was an old chief, his face a magnificent map of wisdom and hardship, every line a story. The other 3 were young women, his daughters, their faces proud and unreadable. The chief raised a hand in a gesture of peace, but there was no peace in Nathaniel's heart. The old man's voice was like rocks tumbling down a mountain, ancient and powerful. "I am Voken," he said, his English perfect and precise. "The bluecoats push us from our lands. We move with the seasons, but the seasons are being erased. We need a place to anchor ourselves." Nathaniel just waited. He was good at waiting. It was all he had left. Voken's eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through the layers of dirt and grief, into the hollow man beneath. "I see your land is poor," the chief said, his gaze sweeping over the skeletal cattle and broken fences. "I see you are alone." He gestured to his 3 daughters, who sat on their horses like queens. "This is Mesa, wise in the ways of the earth. This is Neva, who sees spirits in the wind. And this is Sauteo, who stands in the storm and does not bend." The 3 women stared back, their expressions masks of stone. They were not here to be judged. They were here to judge him. "A man alone cannot hold this land," the chief said, his words a simple, undeniable truth. "The wind will take it. The winter will take it. Or other men will take it." And then he made an offer so insane, so impossible, that it shattered the silence and broke the world. "I offer you a trade, a kinship, an alliance. You will take one of my daughters as your wife. My people will be your allies. We will graze our herds on your far pastures, and no man will dare challenge a ranch protected by the Cheyenne." Nathaniel's mind was a sudden violent storm. A wife? The word was a betrayal, a desecration of Mary's memory. It was unthinkable, impossible. He felt a hot flash of rage. How dare this man come here and speak of replacing her? He opened his mouth to tell him to take his offer and ride straight to hell. But the chief wasn't finished. His voice dropped, becoming a low conspiratorial rumble that was meant for Nathaniel alone. "And you," the chief finished, "will have a dowry, a bride price to seal this bargain between our people. He paused, letting the weight of his final words settle. 1,000 horses? 1,000 horses. The number didn't compute. It was a fortune, a kingdom. It was more wealth than Nathaniel had ever imagined in his life. It was a lifeline thrown to a man who had already decided to drown. 1,000 horses could rebuild everything. It could buy the finest cattle, hire a dozen ranch hands, fix every broken thing in his life. It was a new beginning, but the price was a ghost he wasn't ready to face. The price was moving on. He looked at his broken fences, his starving cattle, the cabin that felt more like a grave every day. He wasn't living. He was just a caretaker for his own sorrow. What was he even holding on to? A memory? An emptiness? The choice is not mine or yours, Voken said, seeing the brutal war waging in Nathaniel's eyes. He knew he had already won. It will be theirs. He turned and spoke to his daughters in their own tongue, his voice soft and flowing. Mesa, the eldest, looked to the horizon, her eyes on the future of her people. Neva, the quiet one, seemed to be listening to the land itself, her head tilted as if hearing a song no one else could. But it was Salteo, the youngest, the one with fire in her eyes, who acted. She nudged her horse one step forward. Just one step. It was a small movement, but it was a seismic shift. Her chin was high. Her gaze was a challenge, aimed directly at Nathaniel. She wasn't a bride being offered. She was a warrior stepping into the fight. She had chosen. The world tilted. The deal was struck without another word. Within an hour, everything was new and terrifying. The Cheyenne rode for the hills, their forms melting back into the landscape from which they came. But they did not leave silence behind. They left a sea of horses that filled the valley from one end to the other, a living, breathing ocean of muscle and hide. The thunder of their hooves wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of a new life, the sound of a promise, the sound of a prison, and standing alone in the yard, a small leather bundle at her feet, was Sauteo. She watched her family disappear over the ridge, a single lonely figure against the vast empty sky, a warrior who had just been left on an enemy shore. Nathaniel stood on his porch, the new owner of 1,000 horses and a wife he didn't know, a wife he didn't want. And in that moment, surrounded by a fortune beyond his wildest dreams, he had never felt so poor in his entire life. The first days were a war of silence, but this was a new kind of silence. Nathaniel's old silence, the one he shared with Mary's ghost, was empty, hollow. This new silence was heavy, charged with the presence of a stranger who watched his every move. It was the silence of a held breath, of two predators circling each other, waiting for the first sign of weakness. He did his duty. He offered her the cabin. He gestured to the door, a clumsy, half-hearted invitation. He would take the barn, he thought. It was the right thing to do. The bedroom inside was Mary's. Her things were still packed away in a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. The thought of this stranger sleeping in that room made his stomach clench. Soteo looked at the dark cabin door, a gaping mouth that promised to swallow her. Then her gaze shifted to the rough, empty barn. She looked at him, her eyes unreadable, then picked up her bundle and walked, not to the cabin, but to the barn. She chose an empty horse stall, swept it clean with a broken branch, and laid out her simple bedroll. The line was drawn. The battleground was defined. She would honor the bargain her father had made, but she would not enter his life. She would not step inside his home, his grief, his world. She was on his land, but she was not with him. She was an army of one, occupying foreign territory. Their world shrank to a series of tense, unspoken gestures, a new set of chores. In the morning, he would leave a plate of food, jerky, hard bread, on a crate outside the barn door. He would turn and walk away without looking back. Hours later, the plate would be returned to the same spot, wiped clean. A transaction. Rations for a soldier. He watched her from a distance. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on his new investment, but he was studying her. She moved among the 1,000 horses with a whisper and a touch, a queen moving among her subjects. The herd, which was skittish and wild around him, settled at her approach. She seemed to speak their language, a language of quiet confidence and respect. She wasn't a bride waiting for a husband. She was a woman with a job to do, and she was doing it better than he ever could. He watched her one afternoon, a small figure in the vast pasture, and saw her kneel. She dug at the dry, cracked earth with a sharp stone. A few minutes later, she stood, holding something. She was foraging. Later, he saw her find a spring he'd thought had run dry years ago. A thin trickle of water she coaxed from the earth. He was the owner of this land. He had the deed, signed and sealed in a dusty office in Redemption. But she was its daughter. She knew its secrets, and every secret she uncovered felt like a small defeat, a quiet reminder that he was the true stranger here. Then the storm came. It wasn't a normal Wyoming storm. The sky turned a sickly green and black. The wind stopped mourning and started screaming, a banshee howl that tore at the roof of the cabin. Rain came down in sheets of ice, hitting the ground so hard it looked like the earth was boiling. Nathaniel stood on his porch, the wind trying to rip the coat from his back, and he watched the thin walls of the barn tremble. She was in there, in a horse stall, with nothing but a thin bedroll against the freezing cold. She could die out there. And a part of him, a dark, ugly part he was ashamed of, whispered that maybe that would solve the problem. Mary's memory would be safe. The horses would still be his. But the man he used to be, the man who had loved Mary, wouldn't have let a dog freeze to death in that storm. He crossed the yard, the mud sucking at his boots with greedy wet sounds. He shoved open the heavy barn door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it against the inside wall. She was huddled in the far corner of the stall, a small, tight shape in the vast, roaring darkness. He couldn't see her face, only her silhouette against the lightning that flashed outside. He jerked his head toward the cabin. It was an order, an invitation, a demand. Come inside. Get out of the storm. She looked at him, her eyes catching the flicker of his lantern, and she shook her head, just once. A small, stubborn, defiant movement. He felt a flash of white-hot anger, the sheer pride of her. He was offering her shelter, and she was refusing it. But then, just as quickly, the anger was replaced by something else, something that felt dangerously like respect. She wasn't afraid of the storm. She was a part of it. She was the one who stands in the wind and does not bend. He left, slamming the door against the gale. He went back to the warmth of his cabin, to the fire he'd built in the hearth. He sat in his chair, the ghost of Mary in the seat beside him, and he listened to the storm rage. And he thought of her, alone in the dark. He couldn't leave her there. He went back out into the screaming wind. This time he brought two of his thickest wool blankets, the ones from the trunk at the foot of Mary's bed. He brought a second lantern and an armful of dry firewood. He didn't try to hand them to her. He didn't say a word. He just set them on the clean-swept ground outside her stall. A silent offering. He took a metal bucket from the corner, built a small, contained fire in the center of the barn. Far from the hay, the small flame pushed back the roaring darkness, creating a tiny island of warmth and light. Then he left again, pulling the heavy door shut, bracing it against the storm. He had done his duty. The next morning, the world was washed clean and unnaturally quiet. The storm was gone. He walked to the barn, his boots crunching on a thin layer of ice. He opened the door, expecting the blankets to be gone, the fire dead. The fire was out, its ashes cold. But the two wool blankets were neatly folded right where he'd left them. And sitting on top of them was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if about to take flight. It wasn't a thank you. He knew that instantly. It was a payment, a piece of her skill for his supplies, a trade. They were still keeping score. The 1,000 horses forced them together. The work was too much for one person, or even for two people who refused to speak. A new routine formed without a single word ever being spoken. He worked the fences, stretching the new wire he'd bought with the first horse sale. She worked the herd, her quiet presence a calming force among the wild animals. Their paths would cross in the high pastures. He would be hammering a post, and he'd look up to see her on a ridge, watching him. A flick of her wrist, a silent command, would tell him where to drive a stray group of horses. A sharp two-note whistle from him would warn her of a washed-out gully ahead. They were two ghosts, haunting the same ranch, slowly, grudgingly, learning each other's patterns. Then the food began to change. He'd come back to the cabin after a long day, exhausted and hungry, to find a small pile of wild onions on the porch steps. The next day, strange, broad-leafed greens he didn't recognize. He was suspicious at first, but his hunger won out. He started cooking with them, adding them to his bland stews of jerky and beans. The flavors were new, wild, sharp. It was the taste of the land itself. She would leave the offerings. He would cook them. They ate apart, he in his house, she in her barn, but for the first time, they ate the same meal. It was the only thing they shared, a silent communion. Summer bled into fall. The aspens on the high slopes turned to brilliant, heartbreaking gold. The silence between them was changing. It was no longer a wall, a battlefield. It was just quiet, a shared space. He found himself looking for her shape on the horizon, a strange, unwelcome comfort in her steady, predictable presence. He was still grieving Mary, but the grief was different now. It was no longer an active, howling pain. It was a dull, constant ache. And this new, quiet life was a distraction from it, a distraction he was starting to depend on. He was mending a fence on the far side of the property, miles from the cabin, when it happened. He was stretching a line of wire, his mind on the coming winter, when his horse suddenly shied, screaming. Coiled in the dust, almost invisible, was a rattlesnake, its tail a dry, buzzing blur. The horse reared, its eyes white with terror, and Nathaniel went down. Hard. He heard the crack of bone before he felt the pain, a sick, wet snap that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Then the pain hit. White-hot fire shot up his leg, from his ankle to his hip. He cried out, a raw animal sound. He tried to push himself up to stand, but the leg gave way completely, folding under him. He fell back into the dust, grit in his teeth, the world spinning in a nauseating wave of agony. He was miles from home. His horse was gone, having bolted in terror. He was utterly, completely alone. The sun was starting to dip towards the mountains. The cold was coming. He was going to die out here. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. After everything, after surviving the fever that took Mary, after surviving 3 years of grief, he was going to be killed by a snake in the dirt. He didn't know how long he lay there, drifting in and out of a haze of pain. It might have been minutes. It might have been hours. But eventually a shadow fell across him, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. He blinked, trying to focus. A figure stood over him. It was Soteo. She must have seen his riderless horse return to the barn, and she had come looking for him. Her face, usually a stoic, unreadable mask, showed a flicker of something. Not alarm, not pity, just focus. She knelt beside him, her movements economical and sure. Her hands, surprisingly gentle, examined the leg. She prodded the swollen, misshapen ankle, her touch firm. He grunted in pain. Broken, she said. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him. Getting back to the cabin was a nightmare of pain he would never forget. She practically carried him, his arms slung over her small shoulders, her strength astonishing. She half dragged, half supported him, step by agonizing step, across the miles of unforgiving terrain. He passed out twice. When he came to, she was still there, still moving, her face set with grim determination. She laid him on his cot in the main room of the cabin, the room where he'd spent so many nights alone. He expected her to leave then, to go back to her barn. Her duty was done. The bargain didn't include nursing, but she didn't leave. She took the knife from his belt. With a few quick, efficient movements, she cut away his pant leg, exposing the horribly swollen and bruised limb. Then she went back outside. She returned with two straight, sturdy branches for a splint and strips of cloth she'd torn from a clean shirt in his own trunk. Mary's brother's shirt. Then, with a skill that was both terrifying and beautiful, she set the bone. She gripped his leg, one hand on his heel, the other below his knee. She looked him directly in the eye and gave a single sharp nod. And then she pulled. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the deepest parts of him as the broken bones ground against each other. But her hands never wavered. Her face never changed. She held the tension until she felt the bones slide back into place, then expertly wrapped the splints, binding them tight. For the next 2 weeks, he was a prisoner in his own bed. And the wall between the cabin and the barn, the line they had drawn between their two worlds, finally came down. She moved into the main room. She brought her bedroll from the barn and laid it by the fire. Not in the bedroom, never in the bedroom, but she was in his home. The silence was finally, truly broken. She did everything. She tended his wound, changing the dressings with herbs that smelled of pine and damp earth. She cooked for him, her stews now rich with flavors he'd never tasted. And she ran the entire ranch with its 1,000 horses, all by herself. He would lie there, helpless, and listen to the sounds of her working from dawn until dusk. In the long, quiet hours of his recovery, he just watched her. He saw the bone-deep exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. He saw her, in the evenings, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor with her finger, patterns of her people, and he saw a look of profound, heart-wrenching homesickness flash across her face before she quickly smoothed it away. She was a soldier, but she was an exile too. One night as she fed the fire, the flames dancing on her high cheekbones, he found his voice. "Your name," he said, his own voice rough from disuse. "Your father said it means, stands in the wind." She turned, her dark eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. She was quiet for a long moment, and he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she spoke, her voice a whisper. "It is the name of a lone tree near our winter camp. The winds there are strong enough to strip the bark from the pines. But that one tree has never fallen. It bends. It survives." He looked at this woman, this stranger who was his wife, this warrior, this exile. He had taken her as part of a bargain, a piece of property to save his own life. He had seen her as a price to be paid. He'd never once, not for a single moment, thought about what it had cost her. "You gave up your home," he said. The words felt small and stupid. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She looked at him, her eyes clear and deep and honest. "My people have a home for the winter. The horses have grazing land to grow strong. My father's bargain was a good one." She wasn't a victim. She had never been a victim. She was a soldier who had made a sacrifice for her people, and she had made it with her eyes wide open. He had been so trapped in his own grief, so obsessed with his own loss, that he'd never even thought to look for hers. And for the first time in 3 long, silent years, Nathaniel Prescott felt something other than sorrow. He felt a deep, humbling, gut-wrenching shame. And deep beneath the ice around his heart, he felt the first painful crack. The first snow came early that year, a fine white powder that dusted the mountains and turned the world quiet. His leg healed, but it left him with a limp, a constant nagging reminder of the woman who had saved his life, a reminder he was starting to welcome. The wall between them was gone. She still slept by the fire, her bedroll a quiet statement of the line she would not cross. But they ate at the same table now. The silence between them was easier, more comfortable. It was no longer a weapon, but a shared space, a language of its own. He started learning her language in small pieces, the names of herbs, the signs of changing weather. She learned his, the sadness in his eyes when his gaze lingered on the empty side of the bed, the way his hands, so calloused and rough from work, could be surprisingly gentle when he mended a bridle. They had to go to town for supplies. The 1,000 horses had made Nathaniel a man of interest. He was no longer the town's sad charity case, the broken widower to be pitied. He was a man of wealth, a man of mystery. Whispers followed him now instead of sympathetic glances. Saudio sat beside him on the wagon seat, wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe he'd insisted she take. It was the first time they had appeared in public as anything. As they drove down the muddy main street of Redemption, the town went quiet. The hammering from the blacksmith stopped. The laughter from the saloon died. Windows became frames for staring, hostile faces. In front of the mercantile, a group of men who had been lounging on the porch stopped talking, their eyes, hungry and filled with a venomous mix of curiosity and contempt, fixed on Soteo. Nathaniel felt a hot, protective rage build in his chest. It was a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand resting on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. He could feel her go rigid, her back as straight as a spear, her chin high. She was a queen facing down a mob of peasants. Inside the store, the owner, a sour-faced man named Mr. Hale, gave them a look that could curdle milk. "Prescott," he grunted, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Heard you came into some money." He said it like it was a curse, an accusation. Nathaniel ignored him and gave him his list of supplies. Hale's eyes slid past Nathaniel to Sauteo, who stood silently by the door. "Don't serve her kind in here," he said, his voice a low poison. "You want your goods? She waits outside, with the horses." The air in the store went cold and thin. Soteo didn't move a muscle, but Nathaniel felt the world tilt on its axis. For 3 years he had been a ghost in this town. He had swallowed their pity, their whispers, their scorn. He hadn't cared. But this was different. This was not an attack on him. It was an attack on her. He slammed both of his hands flat on the wooden counter. The sound cracked through the silence like a rifle shot. Several items on a nearby shelf rattled and fell. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp and cold and dangerous. A razor's edge. "Her name," he said, leaning forward so Hale could see the fury in his eyes, "is Sauteo Prescott. She is my wife, and you will show her the respect that name commands." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a snarl. "Now you will fill my order, or I will take the business of my 1,000-horse ranch to the next town over. And I will make sure every single person from here to Cheyenne knows exactly why." Hale's sour face turned the color of raw meat. He had misjudged the man standing before him. This wasn't the broken, shuffling widower he knew. This was someone else, someone dangerous. He had poked a bear he thought was dead. Grumbling, sputtering, Hale filled the order, slamming the heavy sacks of flour and sugar on the counter. Nathaniel had drawn a line in the snow, a line between his new life and his old one, a line between him and them. As they rode out of town, the silence in the wagon was different again. It was the quiet of an army that had just won its first battle, the quiet of two soldiers in a trench who had just survived the same mortal threat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. "He had no right," Nathaniel said, his hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles were white. He hadn't done it for her thanks. He hadn't even really thought about it. He'd done it because, in that moment, her honor had suddenly, inexplicably, become his own. He looked over at her. Her face was turned away from him, watching the mountains grow closer. They weren't two strangers, bound by a bargain anymore. They weren't a ghost and a soldier. They were a family, and they had just made some very dangerous enemies. The stand in town had consequences. The whispers in redemption festered, turning ugly and poisonous. The story changed, twisted by jealousy and hate. Nathaniel hadn't earned his horses in a bargain. He'd stolen them. The Cheyenne woman wasn't his wife. She was some kind of witch who had him under her spell, who had tricked him into turning his back on his own kind. The store owner's son, Walter, a young man with a soul as empty as his eyes and a mouthful of saloon bravado, started talking. He talked about the fortune that had been stolen, a fortune that rightly belonged to white men. He talked about taking it back. And in the dark, smoky corners of the saloon, other men, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from another man's misfortune, started to listen. A week later, they came. Nathaniel saw them at dusk, a dozen riders moving as a single dark shape against the snow-covered hills. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were coming for a war. "Inside," he told Soteo, his voice sharp and urgent. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs over the mantel. "Bar the door." She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She slipped inside the cabin without a word. He heard the heavy wooden bar slide into place. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it was something. He stood on the porch, rifle held loosely at his side, and he waited. His heart was a hammer against his ribs, but his mind was ice cold and clear. He wasn't just defending land anymore. He wasn't defending a memory. He was defending a life. His life. Their life. Walter Hale and his mob of drunks and malcontents circled the cabin, their horses churning the clean snow into brown slush. "Prescott!" Walter shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and whiskey. "We've come for what's ours. Send out the witch, and we might let you live." "This is my land," Nathaniel's voice was flat and cold. carrying easily in the still evening air. And that is my wife. You have one chance to ride away from here with your skin intact. Walter laughed, a high, ugly sound. We ain't asking. He raised his rifle, and the standoff began. A dozen guns against one. Nathaniel knew he couldn't win. He was just buying time. But for what? A miracle? He didn't believe in miracles. Then he heard it. A low rumble. A sound that wasn't thunder. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. A deep, primal vibration. The horses of Walter's men began to scream, their eyes rolling in terror. And from over a small rise behind the barn, a wave of horseflesh crested and broke. Not a dozen horses, not 100, hundreds upon hundreds of them. A living, breathing avalanche of muscle and hooves, a stampede moving at a full gallop, aimed directly at the mob. It wasn't a random stampede, it was a weapon. The 1,000-horse dowry had become a 1,000-horse army. And at the head of it, riding bareback on a powerful black stallion, her dark hair flying behind her like a battle banner, was Soteo. She hadn't hidden in the cabin. She hadn't cowered behind the barred door. She had slipped out the back window. She had gone to the herd, and she had unleashed the very thing they had come to steal. The mob shattered. It was pure, terrifying chaos. Men were thrown from their saddles as their horses bolted. They were screaming, firing their guns wildly into the air. In the middle of it all, Nathaniel saw Walter Hale, his face a mask of disbelief and terror, trying to control his panicked horse. Nathaniel raised his rifle. He lined up the sights on Walter's chest. He could end it. Right here. Right now. But he didn't shoot to kill. He fired once. The bullet hit Walter's rifle, sending it spinning out of his hands and into the snow. He strode forward off the porch, his limp forgotten, and dragged the boy from his saddle. He pressed the hot muzzle of his own rifle against Walter's chest. Get out, he snarled, his voice a roar that cut through the chaos. Get off my land, and if I ever see your face again, I won't miss. The mob gathered their wounded and what was left of their courage and fled into the night, a scattered, broken mess. The thunder of the herd died down as Sodeo, with a series of sharp, bird-like calls, turned them back toward the high pasture. The silence returned, settling over the ruined snow. She rode up to him, her face flushed and bright with victory, and slid from her horse. They stood there, in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the evidence of their battle. They had faced the world together, and they had won. He looked at her, this impossible woman who had saved him yet again. All the ghosts, all the grief, all the silence, it all just turned to dust and blew away on the cold night wind. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a single perfect snowflake from her hair. His hand lingered on her cheek, his rough thumb stroking her skin. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for just a second. You should have stayed inside, he whispered. A small smile touched her lips. The wind does not hide from the storm, she said. It sings with it. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the empty, aching space in his heart was finally impossibly full. He was no longer Mary's widower. He was Soteo's husband. He was home. That night after the raid, everything was different. Nathaniel walked into the cabin, the air still smelling faintly of gunpowder and fear. He went to the mantel and took down the small, silver-framed picture of Mary. He polished the glass on his sleeve, looked at her smiling face for a long moment, and then he walked into the bedroom. He opened the heavy wooden trunk and placed the picture gently inside, on top of her folded dresses. He was closing a door, not locking it. He was honoring a memory, not living in it. He turned to Soteo, who stood by the fire watching him. The fire is warmer in here, he said, his voice quiet but steady. This is your home now, all of it. She looked at him, a long, searching look. Then she nodded once. That night she brought her bedroll from its place by the hearth and laid it on the floor in the bedroom, next to his cot. Winter thawed. Spring turned the ranch green and vibrant with new life. The herds grew strong, and the land, which had once seemed so barren, now felt rich and full of promise. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place of life. They worked as one, their silence now a comfortable conversation that needed no words. He learned the rhythm of her days. She learned the shape of his thoughts. One evening, as the sun was setting, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. It was Chief Voken. He had returned. He sat on the porch with Nathaniel, the two men watching Sao Teo as she moved through the horses in the corral, her presence a calming balm. Voken looked at the healthy horses. He saw the mended fences, the sturdy new corral, the small gardens she had planted near the cabin. But most of all, he saw his daughter's face. He saw the peace that had settled there, the quiet confidence in her eyes. "When I left her here," the chief said, his voice a low rumble, "I feared I had traded her life for my people's survival." "She saved my life," Nathaniel replied, his eyes never leaving Soteo. "In more ways than one." The chief nodded, a slow, satisfied smile touching his lips. "You have honored the bargain. You have honored her." Later that night, after Voken had left, Nathaniel and Sauteo stood on the porch together, under a vast, brilliant canopy of stars. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural. It felt right. "I was a poor man when your father came," he said softly. "Not because I had no money, because I had no future. I was just waiting to die." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the starlight. "And now?" He looked down at their joined hands, then back into her face. He saw his wife, his partner, his heart. "Now," he said, and a true smile, the first in years, finally reached his eyes. "I own 1,000 horses, and I am the richest man in the world." He drew her close and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but something deeper. A kiss of quiet gratitude, of profound respect. It was the kiss of a man who had been lost in the wilderness of his own grief and was finally led home by a woman who knew how to stand in the wind. What do you think of their incredible story? If you believe in the power of courage and second chances, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of the past.